All right, let's have a quick look at how to do this. Just some sort of a single brush stroke to paint a full tree or a branch with a few leaves and flowers, and actually turn this into an animation and maybe fade it away at the very end. All right, so this is what it looks like at the very end. If you exported that to an AVI, you can also then view it in your preferred video player, or convert it to animated GIF or some other with some other tools. So let's just see how we do this from scratch, right? We initially have perhaps a single image. Let's go and set something like 800 by 800, whatever the dimensions might be. And the starting point for the initial brush stroke that will do a sort of a painting is something like using the particle brushes. So you make sure you're on the brush tool and select particles. Now there are different types of particles. There are particles, bristles, orbicals, and foliage. And I'm going to use foliage for this. And here is one that it remembers I was using a little bit earlier. I'm going to show I can load from some presets. This is a beta for version 10 where you have a visual browser, and you also have that, by the way, here under the browse for media. Under foliage you will have a set of different types, different presets, from where you can go and explore some of the parameters if you want to do something different. But we'll just use one of those, maybe this one, and see what that looks like. And this time what we want to do is have that perhaps last a little bit longer. Let me just see if I can grab a slightly different preset. This one, there you go, that one's a little bit longer. Okay, so let's say I want to see this thing grow, and every time I draw it there's a little bit of randomness to it. It might also be following the mouse or using the direction in which I move. Some of them will, some of them will not. So let's say I'm doing one brush stroke that I like. That's not the one yet. That's not it either. Okay, let's settle for this one. So let's say I want to see this one grow. So I'm going to go undo, and I make sure I don't do any other brush strokes. What I can do is hit Shift A to replay that movement, that brush stroke, right? But not only can I do that on the current frame, and I can do it again, Shift A, and it appears to be coming through exactly the same positions. Clear it, Shift A will replay that movement and regenerate whatever the current brush is, regenerate a new brush stroke with the current brush setting. So if I switch to something like particles and do a Shift A, it's a different effect. If I use bristles and enable that and Shift A, it will do bristles along that, and I can go with orbicals, perhaps something like this, and create a very different appearance. Going back to foliage, that most recent brush stroke, Shift A will give me that particular piece of tree. And so what I'd like to do now is show this into an animation, and I'm going to turn the blank image to an animation. Let's say we need about 3 seconds, so I'm going to say 90 frames because we're going to play them at 90 frames per second. And I still have that brush stroke. I can now go and replay it. Now when I replay it, it's still only on the first frame. You see the frames up here. There's only one frame into which it painted. So clearly what we need is a mechanism to say that's okay, but now paint it in a cumulative way from one frame to the next. So under the animation menu, you will see the brush stroke player, the stroke player. And with the stroke player, the default is just to paint it on the current frame. So that's very similar to what I was using with Shift A. But you can also say play it across each of the frames. Now, if I do that, it's going to be only a small bit and piece on each frame. It's not in a cumulative way. Let me show you that. You basically see the whole progression, and it's an animation, all right, but it's not an animation of the resulting tree that's showing how it's growing and accumulating what it's shown so far. So this is interesting for fireworks if you want some smoke effects and some sort of like inverting the whole thing. Will make it look like you have some sort of an animated smoke trail or fireworks and that sort of things. So that's interesting, but not what we're looking for. So I'm going to go and clear it to white again and clear the animation. to white for each frame, and I'm going to say I need to replay that not on all frames in the default way, but in what we call the Hancock way. And in the Hancock way, what it's doing is it's rendering the first frame and then re-render or copying that over to the second and rendering for the second frame, and keep building up to gradually show you a progression that is taking more time every time, but eventually will have the entire sequence captured as an animated growth of that tree. And that's how easy it is to build that. So once we have that completed, we can do other things. We can save it to AVI. We can do a little bit of extension at the very end. Let's see what it looks like right now. Right, so sometimes we need some frame editing at the very end. So when we look at the last frame, there's one or two that stayed blank. Maybe we want to get rid of those. So let's go scroll to the end of the sequence here, and you see 2 frames that are blank. We can select them both. Select, click and drag, and then delete those. Or we could simply say, well, these are not changing much. From about here on, they're all the same. What we could do is select from here to here and then just replicate that. Maybe we'll delete these 2. Let's go minus and minus again. I think that's the last one here. There you go. Minus that. So we now are looking at the last frame that has a tree, but there's a few with the same. And so we could go and select just those 2 or 4 images here. Let's say select from here to here and then copy that block. So we have selected a block. Let's copy the block, then go to the beginning or the last one here where we want to insert that block. If you want to do that for a few more frames and many times, what you can do is select again and say, okay, let's go and select that whole thing. This is a toggle, so you need to go and do it again. There you go. Copy this one and insert it. So we now have a few more. We can also change the out marker, so that makes that whole selection now being the current block. And copy that block one more time and paste it in or insert it. So we now have a longer phase where the tree just stays there, and that's useful because we want to kind of fade out, right? So at the very end, we don't want to just keep it there, we want it to fade away. And so to do that, we'll go to the timeline. Now, before we do that, perhaps it's a good idea to grab a snapshot, go to the store animation to disk. That way we have a snapshot copy of it, and it's easy to repair the whole thing if we need to get back to it. One thing I might want to do, for instance, is recenter the tree a little bit, right? Luckily, I'm not hitting any borders here, and so I can shift it all to the center. And I might want to go with one of the last frames and use that as a reference. Go to the filter and transform it with the shift option. I could also use the transform option, in fact, to resize it as well, but here I want to keep the original size and just move it sideways. And you see how it's wrapping around, so I'm going to center it around here and click Ani for animate, so it's applying that same shift to the entire frame sequence, which allows you to recenter the entire sequence of frames, that entire animation. And then the next thing is to simply say, okay, the last couple of things here, frames we need to fade. Maybe I need a few more, so I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to go to the last frame and set the out marker to that. Copy that block that I currently have, copy block, and put that into the sequence here. Insert this block one more time. So we have another 20 or so frames, and that makes almost another second of the animation with just holding it. Right from about here, we're at frame 88 or 90, and we got to 120. So we have another 30 frames, easily a full second and a half of just holding it. And what I want to do is just fade it away here. So what I'll do is I'll go to the timeline and indicate I want to add some color, which is really, you can add or subtract. And if you subtract, you're going dark on the red channel, the green and the blue channel. But you can also do the opposite. You can go and saturate it all the way to full white. And so the idea is, if I want this to fade to white, what I can do is simply say pick this and it fades to that. I do that at the very end of the sequence. So I set a key frame here, and then around here I want to reset it back to what it was before the filter is being applied. Click reset, and then I can say from where I want that. Maybe I don't want it while it's still growing, but only shortly after it stopped. So I want to about here keyframe it to that. So we now have keyframe transitions, and it's going to fade away to the end. Okay, apply that, and we're done. We can now go and play it like this, see it grow, and then fade away. And so the last step, of course, is to save that as an animation. You might want to go to animation menu, save AVI, and if you've already saved an AVI before, it will remember the location. In fact, here, if I navigate to that, you'll see that I also have a subdirectory for GIF if I use some other tools, maybe to convert it to animated GIF. But here I'm going to use a different name, just not to overwrite the existing one. Maybe this is AVI2, and save it like that. When you save it, you also get to choose what's called the compression codec, the compressor, and if you don't, it's a fairly large file, so I recommend something like Lagarith, which is a lossless codec. It is well compressed, it does a pretty good job, it's a fast one, it's free also, and it does a really clean compression. And on top of that, if you want to post it on Facebook, they actually recognize it, and your video will show pretty well with that as well. So at least in my experience, so far so good. So I'm going to go and save that. And then the last check before you get rid of this project is you really want to view it. So make sure you click Show to view it with an external playback viewer like Windows Media Player or Irfan View or whatever it is that you're using to view an AVI file standalone by itself. And that way you can be sure that there's nothing that got lost or damaged by using the compressor, because sometimes things can happen, such as when you resize or clip or crop a portion of it, right? Let's say if you look at this here and say, oh, I don't need all this white border around it, and I want to make it a bit more contained to the limits of just the tree, the bounding box. And so one way you could do that is to go to the selection and make sure you enable overlay. It'll be easier to see what's going on, and then use this tool here, the rectangle selection tool, and go somewhere around here, right, and select that area. Now that might be still too big. You might want to do that again until you get very close to the edge of the tree. And here we still have some margin on the left and a little bit at the top as well, so maybe we'll go around something like this. So let's say we want to crop to that. The thing is, we don't know if these are odd dimensions now or even dimensions, and it doesn't matter here inside of Dog Waffle, but it will matter if we save it out to an AVI file, because some of the codecs that you may choose are very sensitive to whether it's an odd number or an even number. It may not work, it may not remember it properly. So let's do this. Let's go and crop to that selection. And mind you, we could have used the crop tool. That's another way to do it too. But the crop to selection will crop to that area. And so now we have the whole animation a little bit tighter in that entire smaller box. But we have to double check if the dimensions are still proper for the export to the codec that you want to use in your AVI. So if you look at image info, it will tell you if you have even or odd numbers. And sure enough, the buffer width now is an odd number. That most likely will be a problem for a number of codecs. Not so much for the codec, well, yeah, to some extent, depending on the codec, but it's also a problem for some of the video players, right? Some of the video players just don't do the right thing when there is an extra bit or a byte or a pixel that isn't accounted for, and it's looking to make it fit on multiples of 2, 4, or 8 pixels at a time. Some codecs even 16. And so what you would need to do in cases like this, after you've cropped it, you will want to be sure that it's still in the right dimensions that you can use for saving to the formats you're about to use. And if you're not sure, if you see that it needs to change, you can do a resample here to resample it to something more fitting, right? For instance, go down to 420 or up to 424, 428, 432. You might want to constrain it. But then sometimes if you change one to make that even, the other one becomes an odd number, right? So occasionally, if you did this manual cropping with just an approximated clip, what you may need to do is resample without the constraints and say, let's make this one 420. And this one here, in fact, could be 640 or 648, or it might need to go down a little bit as well. So let's say, for instance, we want to go to 640 for the height and 420 for the width. So as you do that, it's still going to look very much the same, almost the same as before, but it will be cropped to, we can clear the selection if you still see the marching ends. It will be cropped now and resampled to the proper dimensions. And so when you save that, again, as an AVI, you could go and I'm going to go and just keep it as same name here, but just add another number to that. Let's say number 3. And this one is going to be, I'm also indicating in the file name what's the codec I'm using. So I'm going to go Lagarif or Laga and save AVI using the Lagarif codec. Right? That's one way to save it. And then I'm going to do an experiment and also save it to no compression, right? No compressor, or let's say full frames, or whatever the name is you want to use for that, uncompressed, something like that. And so that's full frames, uncompressed. And when you do that, it may just look okay here, but you really want to double check when you play it back. Click on show, make sure that the video dimensions are good. Looks like, at least for this player, it's good, and that was kind of expected in this case, so we're good to go. Thanks for watching. Hope this was useful. Hope you can create some great animations of foliage that's growing, fireworks that's flying through the air, and all that sort of jazz. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.